Well, thanks everybody for joining us for now the January session of Contemporary Issues. So I hope everybody had a safe and pleasant Christmas and New Year's. And we are going to spend this month at the World Mission Institute at Pittsburgh Seminary. They have an annual conference with speakers and workshops and so forth. And like all good things in 2020, their October conference was all online. So, so we're going to be in Pittsburgh, although I have no idea where the people actually are. The World Mission Initiative, I'm sorry, I said institute and that was wrong. The World Mission Initiative is committed to offering intercultural, experiential learning opportunities for students and congregation mission leaders to help shape the ways that they engage in God's mission. Intercultural experiential learning opportunities for students and congregation mission leaders to help shape the ways that they engage in God's mission. And this year's conference focused in particular on Jesus Christ and the Dividing Wall, Race and God's Mission. Race being the dividing wall between this predominantly, overwhelmingly white part of the church. Pittsburgh is a Presbyterian seminary, and those others in the world who are not white. So looking at how do we engage in mission? So this is kind of meant to be sort of a next step from a lot of the conversations around equity and systemic racism and other forms of sort of baked in oppression that we talked about through the fall. So I commended to you in last Tuesday's Covenant Corner the first plenary lecture by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who is a historian looking at how what he said slaveholder religion had served through time to really prop up white supremacy. So white supremacy as a cultural phenomenon, and slaveholder religion is what Wilson Hartgrove describes the way that religion kind of justifies where we as white folks are in that structure of white supremacy. And Wilson Hartgrove wants us to know that this is important not just as an excuse. It's not an excuse, but it's important to know that we didn't choose that oppressive place in the system. We didn't choose to participate in slaveholder religion, but we learned slaveholder religion through specific habits and practices that have formed us in a religious approach that that also, you know, in addition to everything else it does, it serves to kind of justify the racial hierarchy that is culturally built around us. And so he says that we have to unlearn slaveholder religion as well. So we have to unlearn the habits and practices that have served so far to justify where we are in this oppressive racial hierarchy. So that was your first plenary. So that was kind of extra credit watching to help you kind of make the bridge from where we have been in the fall to where we are now in January. And today we are going to hear from the Reverend Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil. And she is going to talk to us about the journey to reconciliation. And this is again in the context of talking about mission. So how do journeys kind of outside of our familiar lead us toward reconciliation? Dr. Brenda, that's how she chooses to be addressed. Dr. Brenda is a dynamic speaker, author, professor, and thought leader with more than 30 years of experience in the ministry of reconciliation. Her mission is to inspire, equip, and empower emerging Christian leaders to be practitioners of reconciliation in their various spheres of influence around the world. Dr. Brenda is an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Covenant Church, serves as a member of the pastoral staff at Quest Church in Seattle, Washington, and is Associate Professor of Reconciliation Studies at Seattle Pacific University, where she also directs the Reconciliation Studies program. So she knows whereof she speaks, both experientially and academically. Dr. Brenda gave a whole plenary talk. So if you would like, you are welcome to watch that whole thing. It runs just a little bit over an hour. We're gonna focus in on about 16 minutes of her talk. So a chance to kind of hear kind of the core of what she has to say. Any questions or comments before we hand it over to Dr. Brenda? So I didn't warn you or prep you that you were going to be connecting with a story from the book of Acts where Peter, who has followed the Jewish dietary laws all his life, gets then this invitation to go and share in the hospitality of a Gentile as part of the expansion of the gospel through the world during the book of Acts. And what that means as he gets called out into that. I loved what Dr. Brenda said. In theory, we believe in reconciliation, but in practice, we especially, have never put ourselves in a place where we are not in charge. And she speaks to that, the line that Peter says, I know that God shows no partiality, which is often something I think we find ourselves saying that, yeah, of course we know God loves everybody. But she takes that to a next logical step. So if God loves everybody, then what God wants for us, God wants for them, whichever them we are in relationship with. So that for me feels like it's doing some theological work, shifting us from where we have been in conversations about what are these differences, what are these dividing lines between us and them, particularly across racial lines, but we can see that the type of the line matters less than the fact that it's there. And so how do we then move from knowing that that line is there to working for reconciliation across it? Questions or reactions that y'all have following the presentation?
Well, it takes getting out of yourself and your routine to take a step into something like that. It's just a big dare.
A big dare. Yeah.
And here we are, very comfortable in our own little rooms and happy. And when we look at the news of all the stuff going on around us, but it's not touching us. We aren't out trying to change it.
Peter was not comfortable being there, but he carried on.
Yeah. So he recognized that discomfort as Dr. Brenda described the beginning of his speech to the folks assembled at Cornelius's house. And she said, you know, this is not good rhetoric, right? He walked in and said, I shouldn't be here. I don't belong with you. And that was really true and just factual, really, in terms of the cultural dynamic there. And he recognized that and then kept going. Yeah.
This makes me think of a little bit of a parallel on my first trip to El Salvador. Now, this is not quite, what we're talking about, Reverend Brenda was talking about, but I was willing to take the chance, and Bruce, you were with me on that first trip, that we had differences. We were, oh, mercy, like I say, my lifestyle compared to those people. But I had faith in, let's just give credit where it's due to Bob Cook, went down there many years ahead of the current mission co-worker then was Kathy Bassett. I'm not sure if that's her correct name.
Yeah, that's her name.
Yeah, but I was trusting enough to go that Kathy Bassett and Bob Cook and others had gone before me. And even though we had completely different backgrounds, I was curious about their lifestyle and their needs every bit as they were interested in talking to these Americans. Then I think on the third trip, and Pam were on that delegation. We went in 10, 14, and 18, I think is the three that I have been on. And there again, to convince them to go, I would gather they had trust in Bruce and I expressing what our experience was, that they too would go from a somewhat maybe uncomfortable first day or two to kind of getting into it. Now, when it comes to putting it in 2019 or no, 2020, see, I didn't have the trust or the comfort level to go into a real environment that was just, like I say, I was just dumbfounded, first of all, that we had this going on in Des Moines, Iowa. No, this is LA or some other place, not Des Moines, Iowa. I couldn't, well, I just say I didn't have the courage. When things were getting real hot this summer down around the Capitol there for about a week, I wasn't, well, I guess I was lacking faith, or I was lacking courage in terms of my own need to feel that I would be protected from any, what shall we say, get in between two factions maybe that were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I don't know where I should wrap this up, but I think you have to have both groups, both parties have at least enough background on each other that we're willing to give it a go.
Yeah, so there's something in the, as you described, the personal knowledge and the personal background that, as you said, you know, your first trip to El Salvador, having the knowledge of Bob Cook's experience and Kathy Bassett's presence, and that the four of us on the most recent delegation had Kathy with us as well. So that we had a relationship with someone who already knew the lay of the land. Brother Bob, of course, on his first trip to El Salvador in, what was it, 1990? When, if I remember the story right, he went down, had to go via Guatemala, I think it was, and found his way into El Salvador. He had gone down to observe the elections down there. You know, maybe a scenario that's more similar to Peter's story, in terms of he was, you know, Peter was sort of stepping out into this relationship with Cornelius, really kind of sight unseen. You know, he had a vision with a sheet full of animals and a voice from heaven speaking to him, and so, you know, he had a lot to go on, but none of what he had to go on was that sense of this is a safe situation that I'm going into. I'm going to guess that probably Dr. Brenda is going to give most of us some kind of recognition that you know, we may not all be called into you know, being the first one across the line, the way that Bob was heading into El Salvador. You know, at that point, not even on the presbytery's behalf, but under the auspices of some organization. Or Peter's, you know, being the first one to evangelize, you know, to carry the gospel into a Gentile home. But we've got these sort of, you know, relationships that we can come alongside with, and yet, I think you're right that the connection with El Salvador is really relevant. Partly because of what Dr. Brenda's talking about when she talks about these steps that move toward reconciliation. So you'll recognize, of course, that so this is a World Mission Initiative conference, right? And we all know a thing or two about sort of the mission history of European Christianity relative to the rest of the world. We've talked a lot about it, even at the times that we weren't necessarily talking explicitly about the church. So, you know, not that many weeks ago when we talked about the doctrine of discovery. Well, the doctrine of discovery was written by the church, by the Roman church, which was the church of Europe at the time. And so there have always been these sort of theological ways of drawing these lines between us, and we get all the power, and them, and they just supply the resources that we extract from them. Which, again, if you want a good hour of refresher on that, go back and watch the first plenary by Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. But Dr. Brenda is giving us a different sense of how to be in relationship, right? So that old mission relationship was, we have all of the knowledge and all of the wealth and all of the gospel, and we're just going to go and hand it out to who we think we should hand it out to, right? If you are a visual learner, this is decolonizing wealth. which is the book that I commended that can kind of go alongside what we're talking about here, because it's getting at a lot of the same things, that this white supremacist culture that really developed in Europe, centuries ago, has been part of the Euro-American project all along. That this is about, we are in charge, and that's what's different about our partnership in El Salvador, as well as we can pull it off. And it's what's different in Peter's journey out into Cornelius's household, that Peter goes into that household and he's not in charge anymore. He no longer holds the, I know who I am, I know what the boundaries are, and I know that I have something to give you, but you don't really have anything to give me. Instead, he has to sit down and eat what is given to him.
Well, the history of our country, the world travelers trying to discover new lands, is we are superior to whoever we meet. We are here to conquer you or to enslave you. And that's not a good start.
Yeah, that's not a gospel model, is it? So Warren, imagine yourself into what it may have felt like for you if you had ventured down to the state capitol back in June. So we will assume, let's assume that you have some kind of in-person relationship with someone who is already connected with the one or the other or both of the sort of the sides of what was going on down at the Capitol. So you've got Black Lives Matter protesters on the one side, you've got Des Moines police officers and Iowa State Patrol officers on the other side, and so give yourself a relationship with somebody who can kind of be your, who can be your Bob Cook or your Kathy Bassett. Mm-hmm. And then imagine yourself into that experience. What's that experience like, being that far out of your comfort zone?
Well, there again, having been raised in central Iowa and never having inhaled tear gas or had law enforcement out latching on to individuals and putting either handcuffs or straps on their wrists, I probably wouldn't have been on the front lines. If I was down there, I probably would have had enough caution, just the way I am, to be close enough to see what was going on and hear what was going on, but certainly not, like I say, on the front line. That's just my personality. But as much as you see on TV, there's nothing like being physically there. And even in the middle of the crowd or at the rear of the crowd, taking all that in, who knows? Maybe I would have been won over by a group that initially I wouldn't probably think I would align with. If I had some one-on-one discussions, and heard more about personal violations that they had experienced living in Des Moines that I didn't experience, just because, mainly because of my my race and also my neighborhood that I live in. But I think I'd have had some interference on the home front if I'd have gotten in my car and said I'm heading down there. But
It's not safe. It wasn't safe.
yeah, I guess I just am. When people get emotional, they do things that if they had 24 hours to think about it, probably never would have done. And I've seen that, you know. I know that's just part of human nature, crowd mentality, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. And then when it comes, I used to have a convenience store, and I had some plate glass windows knocked out one night. And when I saw that going on at the tire shop, I said, no, wait a minute, you know, up here protesting at the Capitol, what does destroying this guy's plate glass windows and going into his business? I don't think he had too many tires stolen that night. But see, that's where I kind of, I can't make that leap that this is part of our protest, is that we start taking out plate glass windows. And then I think you've got people distorting the evening's initial goals and purpose into just outright enjoyment and vandalism. I think some of the people, well, I know some of the people that were doing some of the vandalism, they had no more interest or connection with the legitimate purpose of the demonstrations. It was evening entertainment. So I guess I would have been very cautious until, in my own mind, I felt that I was safe. I guess I keeps coming back, doesn't it? The security of being around out of control people, and I couldn't be like a KO trying to counsel somebody to do something different. That wouldn't have been my role at all. They didn't know me from a load of hay. I didn't have any credibility to be trying to calm the explosive reaction, and then the patrol and the police. I mean, it just got ugly real quick. It was out of control, and so I guess my personality is such, I just couldn't really picture me, especially at this time in my life, being a crusader. Now, I just put a footnote in there. I would not hesitate to jump on a charter bus to go to Washington, D.C. and raise a lot of hell and not worry about being arrested because it has nothing to do. I am so disgusted with the Washington scene. I mean, there's 435 people, and that whole group, I see, don't have the fear of raising some hell in Washington, D.C. because I think don't want to get into either side. I don't think there's, I don't know what's happening out there. So but I think that really concerns me, that there's going to be some people moving on our leaders, quote unquote, because I don't think we've got any leadership. And I better get off that topic quick. But I'm saying either side of the aisle.
Yeah,
either side of the aisle.
So you draw sort of an interesting distinction, though, because as you kind of sat with the would I feel comfortable or safe, and I think we tend to sort of confuse the two things. I know I tend to confuse the two things, comfort and safety, but and I don't know. I can understand why you're saying you would not have felt safe downtown on that night in June. That may have still been May when they broke the windows at the tire store. But at any rate, so I can recognize what you're saying there. But then as you sat with it, then you thought, well, I could picture somewhere that I might go and rattle some cages. So what it, I'm curious if you've got a sense of whether, okay, jump on a bus and go to Washington. Now, everybody, don't get on a bus right now. Dart's very clear, essential trips only. So it sounds to me like either the setting of Washington, or the company that you imagine keeping, or the people that you imagine talking to, make Washington seem like I don't expect you're about to do this, but make Washington seem like a more approachable place to go make some noise than downtown on the east side of the river.
I think mainly just due to sheer numbers. I'm anticipating that when we keep being disappointed and abused and things are just absolutely out of whack, there would be enough people show up that I guess I would not be.
You wouldn't feel like you'd be out in front.
Yeah, and the fear of being arrested put me in, if nobody pays my bail. Like I say, I don't need to worry about that being on my resume, because I don't need to be concerned about it. But that's a different topic than what we had tonight. But I guess, and like I say, you can tell from my attitude here, it's not just COVID that's bugging me the last year. It's a divided nation, and leaders not stepping up and being leaders. That I guess I better stop, because I'm going to offend some people here maybe. But there, yes, the that's different here. What would have been in my backyard in the Des Moines Capitol compared to me going to the nation's capital. I'm reluctant to do one, but I'm ready to go do the other. And
I'm just curious if there was a lot of looting and breaking in Washington, D.C., would you still feel the same way?
Good question, Ann. See, I was assuming that would not be taking place, that the level of protest of surrounding the nation's capital or the different office buildings that the senators and the representatives have, just to give them a real wake-up call that there's a lot of unrest and unhappy, unsatisfied people in this nation of 330 million people, that they don't seem to have any clue. They don't have a clue of the amount of unhappiness out here. Right now it's COVID, or the economy, or, but there's a smoldering that even if this COVID thing hadn't happened, let's just take that out of 2020.
But if you go to Washington, I mean, a lot of the people feel the same way you do, and you all have a lot in common. Whereas with the racial issue, everybody hasn't experienced the same thing. So it's a little bit different. I mean, I feel more comfortable too going to the group in Washington, but, going down to, a situation like that in Des Moines, especially if I don't know anybody, is, what are you going to run into? And even if you finally understand the issues, how do you get started? What do you do?
But you say going to Washington, D.C., you all have the same feelings, but any group like that, you're going to have counter protesters too. So it's not going to be everybody feeling the same.
True.
And any group like that, there's bound to be conflict, when you get that many people, somebody's going to be against.
So let me pause the specific questions there because I think you're getting at some really interesting, interesting pieces that I think maybe I want to see if we can do a little bit of fruitful work with those. Okay, so so as Ann just said, we've within any group, you know, within any group, you're going to have, say, protesters and counter-protesters, and you've often got protesters and counter-protesters and police, right? And the you know, the police are there with a certain agenda. Now, when the protesters are protesting against the police, which is what we were talking about with the Black Lives Matter protests, the police almost function as counter-protesters in a way that gets real messy real fast. But as Ann says, you've got these different sets of experience. And you're always going to have different sets of experience. And it makes sense for us to be more sympathetic to the experiences that we identify with. Now, if there are lots of different kinds of experience, and as Dr. Brenda said, quoting Peter, God shows no partiality, whose experience do we choose? If we're going to be called outside of ourselves and outside of our own experience, and we don't have to be protesting either, right? We can be, you know, we can be, I don't know, dispersing funds to support community development initiatives in a small hillside canton in El Salvador. You know, we could be advocating in any kind of way. We could be, you know, writing letters and calling our legislators and writing op-eds. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do this. So don't let the mode of sign waving protest get in the way necessarily. But there's a lot of different experiences out there. So there's a we. And part of the way that white supremacy tends to work is to say there's only one we, and it's whoever I, straight white male, say it is, right? But if we know that there are lots of different experiences out there, how do we choose? If we know there are lots of experiences out there and God shows no partiality, but we only have so much attention, how do we choose?
Pardon me for getting in late. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, John.
Okay. What you just said, we. Who's the we? I probably missed something on that.
Oh, fair enough. So let's say we, the 8 of us. Say we, the 8 of us, were to put our heads together, put our hearts together, and choose to advocate on behalf of someone who is not like us. And let's assume we can all agree on a modality, or we can all advocate in our own ways, because I know Russ really likes to shout and hold signs, but Warren would really rather give eloquent speeches. So. So let's assume that you know, we're all going to advocate in whatever ways, but we need to land on, okay, whose interests are we going to advocate for here?
Also, I'm trying to figure out, you said something just as I joined about the police having an agenda. Is that part of this question, or is that something different?
You can set that aside.
Okay.
We were talking about, as an example, what would it feel like to have gone down and participated in or walked alongside one or the other or both of the groups involved in the Black Lives Matter protests in June. And
I'll try to venture an answer. If the we is trying to figure out how to do this, then I think we have to know what the experiences of the people on the other side of the police line are, as well as our own. So I'm not, in other words, I'm not sure that we can answer that question because we don't know what their experiences are. Or are we going to assume some experiences for discussion?
So for discussion, we are going to assume that we have relationships with folks with these various flavors of experience. So that we've got relationships with the folks wearing the helmets and carrying the riot shields, and that we've got relationships with the folks holding the signs and shouting. And how do we parse when those relationships come into, or when those experiences come into conflict? Bruce?
We have choices, and it's oftentimes what's in it for us to participate, what's in it for us to run the Drake relays, or to do a cancer march, or what's in it for us to go to Covenant Church. And what are we going to get out of it?
As an old mediator type, my instant reaction is to say we need to find out more about what those experiences on both sides of the fence are and what they think of the experiences on my side of the fence. And I'm not trying to evade the question. I'm just saying that if we go assuming what their experiences are, we're making trouble. And they us.
I think Dr. Brenda would have something to say to us that would sound similar, I think, to what John just said. Particularly, and I'll set this there, and then I want you to hang on to it for a second, because we'll kind of loop back toward it next week. But that piece of understanding what they, whichever they were talking about, what they perceive of us and our involvement in the situation. And we're often involved in the situation, whether we recognize that about ourselves or not. So understanding better, okay, who are we in this? What is our role in this complex of experiences going on here? I think when Dr. Brenda, and in the full talk, she spent a little bit more time earlier on laying out this experience that she had as a scholar of reconciliation and a practitioner of reconciliation. They went to Ferguson shortly after. Shortly after the killing by police there, Brown, in 2014, and their experience being there in relationship. So again, you've got a Black Lives Matter. That was sort of the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement as a thing that white people noticed anyway, and the police sort of were the two sides of this argument, and they dropped right down with the Black Lives Matter folks, and I would say that they made that choice deliberately, and in that relationship with them, those folks said, okay, we are going to be right here doing this. Are you coming? And I would say that the reason that they landed where they were, where they landed when they went to Ferguson, was that they recognized that these are not peers who are having this argument, but rather there's a power imbalance already there, and so the police have the weapons and they have the sanction of the state behind them, and the protesters don't. That does not mean that the police don't have anything meaningful to say. But when they looked at this imbalance, what Dr. Brenda and her colleagues saw was this imbalance, that someone's voice gets a lot more play than somebody else's. Someone's voice is presumed to be correct, and someone else's is not. And so they were finding that dynamic, and they chose to stand on the bottom side of that dynamic. As John points out, there's then multiple sides to understand, and where did a lot of this dynamic of relationship between the police and the African American community of Ferguson come from? She talked about while they were there, that was when the decision not to bring charges against the police officers in New York who killed Eric Garner, when that decision came back. And so there was also this understanding that this is a widespread dynamic. This dynamic is not even, it was there before these individuals that they're working with. But they said, okay, we need to stand on the side of those who have less power and those who have less stature. But this is where we'll loop back to this other piece. As John said, there's also the question of what do we, and here again, the 9 of us here, 8 of us here, I can count. So the 8 of us here, as white folks in the Midwest, we have a certain sort of place in sort of, if there's an argument going on culturally right now, about how do white folks and people of color relate to each other in the United States. We have a certain place in that. And as John says, it would be good for us to know how others are looking at us, what we look like to others. During the Q&A of the talk that we listened to this evening, someone asked a question that kind of got to that. And so the question was, okay, you've talked about the young people who are looking at the church, the established church, and these young people who are not, they're not seeing the church show up. And that was the question that the activists had asked those church leaders. We're going to be at the steps of City Hall or whichever it was at 4 o'clock. Are you going to be there? Are you going to show up? And so that was sort of the question that grabbed her. So someone asked in the Q&A, okay, so how can churches show up with disillusioned young people? And she said, I need to add a word there. It's white young people who are leaving the church. It's white young people who are leaving the church. So there's a racial dynamic in who is giving up on the church because it's not showing up. And she said that she is more concerned speaking to a white church, and again, she was speaking to Presbyterians by and large, speaking to a white church, what we need to pay attention to is not only, oh, we need to go understand them, but we do need to understand ourselves and understand how we have been shaped, so that we can understand why we keep doing the things we do and why the world is built the way it is. And ironically, there is nobody better to tell white people why the world works the way it is than Black people. because so much of the way that the United States works, so much of the system that we've got built around ourselves is built to maintain white privilege at the expense of anybody who's got privilege we can take, but especially at the expense of African American people. And even more so at the expense of Native American people. So to hear, okay, what do we do with this? Here's your pitch for next week. Next week, we get Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove, who gave that first plenary that I offered to you for extra credit, and Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, who we heard from tonight. They're going to have a conversation together. So the question is, where do we go from here? And so, one, where do we go sort of internally as the white church? And then externally, where do we go in mission? Where does our next mission trip need to be? So they're gonna offer us some ways to wrestle with how do we move out in mission so that we can truly bear witness to Christ's love for the world. We'll touch on that next week.